Peter Alegi is a professor of history at Michigan State University, where he has received several teaching awards for his courses on South Africa, modern Africa, and global soccer. He is the author and editor of several books, including La Duma, Soccer, Politics, and Society in South Africa, African Soccerscapes, How a Continent Changed the World's Game, and Africa's World Cup. His new book, Cool Under Pressure, Bonga Bonga's Global African Football Life, co-authored with Gerardo Quindes, will be published by Ohio University Press in fall 2026. Alegi is currently writing a book on how scholarly podcasting is changing the field of African studies, a project inspired by his past experience as host of the Africa Past and Present podcast, the longest running African studies podcast in the world. Alegi is a founding member of Sports Africa, a coordinate organization of the U.S. African Studies Association, and convenes the online Football Scholars Forum. Finally, he is the editor of MSU Press's African History and Culture book series and serves on the advisory boards of the International Journal of African Historical Studies and African Studies. Wow, so much to jump into. Makoni, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, Peter, thanks for finding the time to come and talk to us about your areas of interest, etc. Let me get into this conversation with you by asking a question that I think you must be tired of answering. Why soccer? Of all the things that you could have done, how did you end up with this?
This is actually how I start every semester. Every class, I give a very brief introduction to my students to explain how did this white guy show up in my African history class, or why soccer at Michigan State University? And the short answer is that I was born and grew up in Rome, Italy, which is from where I'm speaking to you right now. And so I was born kind of with the football virus, if you will. Almost every young boy back then, maybe not as much today, but certainly back then in the 70s and growing up in the 80s, football was part of the air we breathed, and it was kind of what we did and what we thought about almost every minute of every day. And it was about playing, it was about watching, it was about discussing it and thinking about it. And it hasn't been too bad for my health, I have to say, over the course of the years. I still play today. In fact, I play on several teams, and it has opened the doors all over the world, and especially on the African continent, of course. So it's a way to read societies, but also to engage with people, and to become a better human, I hope. So yeah, so football has been part of my life since I can remember. And what happened was that when I finished university, I had the opportunity to go and coach in South Africa the year before the first democratic elections. I had been interested for political reasons in the anti-apartheid movement. Superficially as a teenager, could have engaged with in the 80s, but nevertheless, I felt like I had read enough, and I had gone to enough demonstrations. I said, I need to go and see for myself. I need to, break bread with people and learn in the more meaningful way, perhaps, than just book knowledge. And I taught in a school that at the time was part of the old Bantu education system. It wasn't called that anymore, but it was called the Department of Education and Training. But this was still segregated education, and it was on the outskirts of Cape Town. And I was a physical education teacher during the day and a sports coach in the afternoon. And as I was there one afternoon, I noticed, I lifted my head during a seemingly meaningless under 12 football match between the boys and a neighboring school, that there were maybe 100 or 150 people watching and following this game very intently from outside the fence. And it just occurred to me that this was the entertainment for the afternoon in a place that was materially very poor. The school was the only brick building in the entire neighborhood, and there were no libraries, there were no shopping centers, there was barely any electricity, there was no running water in the neighborhood. And football was the thing to do. And it wasn't just the family members or friends. It was just people who were looking for something to do in the afternoon. And I thought, if this is happening in 1993, it must have been happening in the same way in the bad old days of apartheid. And so I went off to the library in Cape Town, the National Library, and I did a little bit of research and was astonished to find out that there was no academic monograph on Black football in South Africa. And I thought this was, I shouldn't have been as surprised, Prof, as I was, but that's what being young is all about. And I said, this would be like walking into a library in any town in the United States and there not being any books about baseball. Could you imagine that? I mean, what a huge swath of Americana would be missing. Well, that's what the situation was in the waning days of apartheid in South Africa. And so since I wanted to go back to graduate school, I thought, well, this might be the contribution, the very small contribution that I can make to the democratization, if you will, of culture in the new South Africa, to write a proper scholarly history of football under segregation and apartheid in the townships. And so, this was therefore a personal passion of mine. I also played in South Africa at a fairly decent level. I once played a curtain raiser match before a Chiefs game. It was Kaiser Chiefs versus Santos in Cape Town, and I scored a goal in front of 20,000 people. That's my claim to fame.
That's your claim to fame. Okay. Let me ask you.
Combine the personal and the professional.
Yes.
Many years later, here I am, still.
But let me ask you another not important question. When you compare yourself as a scholar and as a footballer, would you regard yourself as a more effective footballer than a scholar or vice versa? Right.
That's a tough question. We're starting off with some really hard ones, Prof. Okay, let's take age out of the equation.
Yeah, let's take age out of the equation.
Because, a footballer has a very narrow window, right?
Yes.
Probably between the age of 16 and 35 if you're lucky.
Yeah.
I like to think that a scholar gets better with age, like good wine. That's not the case, unfortunately, for footballers. I'm afraid to say. So I don't know. I guess I feel I made the right choice not to pursue football as a career. Ultimately, I think it played out okay. But at the time, my mother, who also was an academic, she thought that I should study rather than play football.
Okay.
She didn't make it easy to pursue a sporting path, but now I think she was the wise guide in my life and made sure that I concentrated on a life of seeking knowledge rather than seeking glory in front of the crowds. But I still play.
You still play. That's interesting. My first encounter with spoken English was playing football in one small town in Rhodesia at a police camp. The town was called Bindura, and there was a white young son to a policeman. And when we were playing, he would say, "Oh, go golly, go golly." And I never knew what he was talking about. I didn't know whether he meant we should all become goalkeepers or we should attack the goalkeeper. We had not. But that was my first encounter with sort of native speaker English. So we used to go to this police station to play football with white police kids, so that we could learn and hear English, because the only English that we could learn or hear was from when you are listening to the radio, etc. But if you wanted to come up with live English, you would go and play football with these guys. And when they are talking to you, because they wouldn't use African languages, they would speak in English. But half the time I can tell you, Peter, we had no clue what they were saying, right? We had no clue what they were saying. So that's interesting. Now, let me continue with this story. When you look back now as a historian, when you think about African football, if you were to tell the story of African football, what are how has it evolved over time? One, and what would you say has been its impact on African politics and on international football generally? Right.
Yeah, I would need 6 hours to begin to do justice to the importance of your questions there. I mean, one of the ways in which I talk about the long trajectory of football or soccer in Africa, and by the way, soccer is a British word, it's not an American word. So everyone on this call should feel perfectly comfortable using the term soccer. You know, the British sometimes get a little testy over the use of the word soccer, but it is a British word. It was devised by, you know, the Oxford Cambridge types in the second half of the 19th century. And if you go into libraries and you look at the old books and biographies of association football in Britain in the first 2/3 of the 20th century, they used the word soccer in the title. So anyway, let's set that aside. But the trajectory is very much one of Africanization. And so when you approached me about joining your conversation, talking about football, you know, I jumped at the chance because football is one of those areas of society and culture in which you see African agency playing out quite forcefully from the very beginning. And so it is a way to tell the story about, yes, colonial conquest and European imperialism, of course, but the story is far more interesting than that because quite quickly, within the first generation of the sort of history of football on the continent, you see African clubs being formed. You see football being played in the schools. You see football, as you pointed out, in the armed forces, in the police forces, being a very prominent pastime. And quite quickly, right, the various colonized peoples of the continent embrace it. And so as that happens, you can now tell the story of, for example, urbanization, right? You can tell the story of wage labor. You can tell the story of the impact of formal Western education. All these themes that historians and linguists and others have been thinking about and working on for a very long time. And as independence begins to be sort of central to the history and the conversations on the continent after the Second World War, football also becomes an avenue to assert political independence. And so I'll say more about this in a moment because you also asked me about African politics. So I'll come. But so you can chart kind of the role of soccer in the political and cultural liberation of the continent as well. And then more recently, right, you can talk about globalization, particularly deep globalization, where you have, for instance, young boys and increasingly young girls, you know, not just playing football, but watching it on television or on their mobile phones and being able to engage with the Premier League, with the UEFA Champions League, as we'll see soon with the World Cup, on the men's side and the women's side. And so you see kind of an assertion of global citizenship through the game. And so for me, you know, it's really a great example of showing how Africa is not a marginal player, but rather quite central to all of these really important historical trends of the so-called modern era. So that's kind of my Twitter version of the story, if you will.
Okay.
Now, anytime you have a popular cultural phenomenon that is this popular and that becomes embedded in local people's lives, you're going to have political repercussions.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets quite interesting because there's the politics during the colonial era is very much a politics of the Europeans, particularly the British early on, but later on also the French and the Portuguese and the Belgians, trying to exploit the game as a way to control the local populations and also to distract them, right? To do exactly what the elites in Europe and in North America had done with major sports previously, and that is keep the workers from having thoughts of going on strike or worse, rebellion or revolution. But these efforts didn't work very well. From very early on, if you look at the colonial documents, for instance, in Southern Africa, it's quite obvious. You know, the white missionaries and also the traders, that sometimes the colonial officials would go and try to organize a team, and they would try to tell folks how to play the game.
Yes,
And
yes.
they would explain that no, you're doing it wrong. It must be played this way. And right away, the local people were like, well, why? Why should I play it in the way that you're telling me to play? Right?
Yes.
This is supposed to be leisure. This is supposed to be fun. I'm supposed to be
Yeah.
free during these 90 minutes.
Uh-huh.
In settler societies in Southern Africa, this was particularly harsh because from the moment you woke up to the moment you went to sleep, you usually had a white boss telling you what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And so football was a kind of sphere of temporary freedom. And you can see this temporary freedom and this kind of agency playing out in how the teams actually played the football. You see?
Yes.
So refusing to play kick and rush football is one of the ways in which I show this kind of cultural resistance. Whereas the British, and particularly the English, more than the Scots, frankly, the English, were all about that high-paced, very physical, ball in the air, crosses from the wings kind of football. Whereas many people locally preferred the game that was more about ball control, was more about dribbling, was more about entertaining the crowds, giving them something to enjoy outside of their often grim daily lives. And so, that's just one example of how Africanization started to cause problems for the original intent of
Okay.
Europeans. But then there's politics of a different kind, not so
Yeah.
much cultural resistance, but rather as the clubs and leagues grew and developed all across the continent, you start to see clubs being very closely tied to various kinds of identities. And so
Yeah.
sometimes, these were identities that were very deeply rooted, like think in Ghana, the team of Asante Kotoko
Yes.
in
Yes.
Kumasi, right?
Yes.
That team, the patron was the Asantehene.
Yes.
The logo of the team is the porcupine, which is the symbol of the Asante army, right?
Yes.
So the team kind of came to express the Asante nation's identity. And that is just one example. I could pick numerous others. In Zimbabwe, you've got the case of Highlanders.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
In Bulawayo, which is
Yes.
kind of the Bele national team, if you will.
Yes. Yes.
In South Africa, you've got Amazulu,
Yes.
which is also has the Zulu king as its patron. So you've got those types of identities that are also fascinating because they're harking back to a pre-colonial era of glory and greatness in many ways, but they're doing it through this modern cultural phenomenon of football. And then you've got other identities which are completely different, and that is the new identities that people, especially men, in terms of the players and the officials in particular, although there were women supporters, of course, from the beginning, the new identities that are formed in the cities. And one of the things that comes up is teams that are formed along occupational lines,
Yes.
right? You have these all over the continent. You have them in Nigeria, you've got them in Senegal, you've got them in Kenya, you've got them in Congo, you've got them in South Africa, Zimbabwe, etc. And that is, the people, often the men who played for the textile company or the ports and harbors company or the railway company, etc., etc. The police, they form their own teams. And so these are people who often come from very different areas. They speak different languages, but they come together in these workplace teams. And those are new identities that are being formed where people across the continent, beginning in the 30s and 40s, and then certainly into the post-war period, see themselves as adding a new kind of social identity to their pre-existing one. And I think that's really fascinating because when African nations become independent, one of their great challenges is fostering a sense of unity and a sense of national identity, which is very difficult to do. So football served that purpose. And there's some clubs, again, if we want to go to Ghana, think of Hearts of Oak in
yes.
many years later. You can think of Kaiser Chiefs in South Africa. It's kind of like a national team almost at the club level. It is kind of an all-encompassing team. Maybe in Zimbabwe would be Dynamos to a certain extent,
yes.
right? In Tanzania, it might be Yanga. Etc. Almost every African nation has one of these super clubs, that fits that bill, and it's a club that's inclusive. It's a club where you find people from all walks of life, and so these have political repercussions because you start to see politicians already in the 1950s, like Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, in Ghana, like Oliver Tambo in South Africa from the ANC, who are keenly associating with football clubs and football fans in order to project an image of populism, right? That they are in tune with the pastimes of the people, and also they often had a passion for sports themselves. So that has political repercussions because that is one of the ways in which, say, the CPP in Ghana and the ANC in South Africa, boosted this quest for liberation, and then later jumped on sports as a way to foster patriotism and national unity.
But if that is the case, then what role we've had recently this Africa Cup of Nations and all that, all these other big organizations and teams and games that we've recently played in Africa. What is the politics of, let's say, the Africa Cup of Nations in the trajectory of the development of African football?
AFCON.
AFCON. Let me put it different. What is AFCON trying to accomplish other than showcasing African football? What is the politics of it all?
Yeah, I mean, AFCON started in 1957 as a political project, as a Pan-Africanist project.
Okay.
What brought the teams together, the nations together at the time, in part, was the fact that FIFA was very much a Eurocentric and quite conservative organization that wasn't giving African football its fair share. And 1957 is a crucial year because the Confederation of African Football was formed just a month before Ghana became independent.
Okay.
And 6 years before we had the Organization of African Unity.
Yeah.
So as I've written in my work, this is an example of a Pan-African institution that was real and functional and scored some early victories right away. For example, apartheid South Africa in 1960 was still a member of FIFA, and FIFA had no anti-discrimination clause in its constitution. People forget about this. The International Olympic Committee in Article 1, right from the beginning in the 1890s, prohibited racial discrimination. FIFA never had that. It was CAF and its allies who forced FIFA to put an anti-discrimination clause in their document. And this happened in 1960, and it's no accident because the Sharpeville massacre happened in March of 1960 in South Africa. And there was the banning of the ANC and the PAC and so on. And this was a way to sanction white South Africa. And in
Yes.
fact, in 1961, CAF and its supporters successfully got white South Africa suspended from FIFA. And
Yes.
so, this was working. This Pan-African front was quite effective. Now, what happens though is by the 1980s, football also changed. The the
Yes.
the Pan-Africanist politics were no longer as important as the commercial attraction that was increasingly in football. And so you start to see sponsors like Coca-Cola, for example, and Adidas, but also other sponsors who start to come in. And you see after Italy 1990, more and more African players going abroad. And
Okay.
and
Okay.
satellite television also. Satellite television starts to grow tremendously. Think in Southern Africa, it starts with Mnet and then goes to SuperSport. But
Yes.
you go to Francophone Africa with Canal Plus and others, right? And the whole business of football takes over. And so the politics of nationalism and internationalism becomes
Okay.
secondary. Yeah, becomes
Okay.
secondary. And so the politics now, when we get to Morocco in 2026, is
Mm.
really where Africa is a big player at FIFA,
Yeah.
but it's a big player in a deeply corrupt system, deeply
Okay.
corrupt, right?
Okay.
And so the game now is about how do you manage to garner more and more of the financial pie, which is growing to the point that FIFA has just declared that they expect to make $11 billion from this World Cup.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Okay. And that money gets redistributed to all the member not all of the money, but a good chunk of that money gets redistributed to the member nations. So if it's $11 billion, the 54 African members of FIFA stand to gain quite a bit of money. But that money, right, doesn't go to where it needs to go, and we can talk about this later,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
That is the politics. The politics is very much a politics of we play the FIFA game, we make sure we're friends with the president, as Patrice Motsepe, the billionaire South Africa,
Yes. Yes.
who is president of CAF, is, and we make sure that the African delegates vote for our people. It's basically a crass cash for votes scheme, and that is the pretty much the only politics that matters right now within AFCON. And Morocco plays a very interesting role in this
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
Morocco for years was trying to oppose South Africa to be able to host the World Cup.
Yes. Yes.
You remember in
Yes.
2010
I do.
when South Africa hosted, they beat
Yeah.
Morocco, but only by a couple of votes.
Uh, uh.
But now Morocco is trying to paint itself as this sort of leader of the African continent, which I find difficult to swallow when they're refusing visas to fans from Ivory Coast, for instance, and other
Yes.
West African nations and beyond, right? So you can't have your cake and eat it too. But there are lots of contradictions involved in this whole process. But now Morocco will host some World Cup games in the next World Cup, the 2030 World Cup
Yes. Yes.
with Spain and Portugal. And so you can say that Morocco playing that kind of FIFA politics has already started to reap some rewards in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
But football is a funny game. As a
Oh.
good South African friend of mine always reminds me, football can kill you. And you remember what happened in the AFCON final.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Morocco was hosting the tournament. They made it to the final. They struggled a bit, but they made it to the final. They were playing Senegal.
Yeah.
And the question then became, who will be the referee of this final?
Uh-huh.
Right? Do you know at what time the previous day the referee was selected? I'll tell you. It was
No.
near midnight. It was near midnight. They still hadn't picked the proper referee to officiate the game, right? And he was finally picked, what, maybe 16 hours before kickoff, 18 hours before kickoff. I mean, who's ever
Uh-huh.
heard of something like this? They picked the referee from DRC, who
Uh-huh.
ended up disallowing a goal by Senegal with just a couple of minutes left, and then gave a preposterous penalty in the 98th minute, right, in added time to the home team. At which point, even the very usually calm Senegalese walked off the pitch and said, "We are not going to tolerate this kind of business." And they had to be lured back after 15 minutes. And karma, the only Catholic player on the Moroccan team, missed the penalty. And then Senegal went on to beat Morocco. So you can try and buy your success, but football has a way of messing with that plan.
Okay. Thanks a lot. The, thanks, Peter. A lot of my colleagues, I think, have got questions that they would like to ask you. So let me hand over to Ian, and then you can invite some of our colleagues who may have questions to ask. I can see Yasmin has a question that you want to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Professor Alegi. Yasmin, you have a question?
Yes, I don't really have a question. I more have a comment about the Moroccan case and the AFCON. So I'm myself from Cote d'Ivoire, and the case of the visa restriction. It's important to like remind that we didn't have visa between Morocco and Ivory Coast. So Morocco and Ivory Coast will have a very strong diplomatic relation. It was the Ivorian government who asked to put visa restriction because Morocco is a hub for migration in Europe, and most of the people in the um, era were using fake Ivorian IDs to go to Morocco and cross. So they wanted to limit the flow of migration, and because of those kind of events where people like a lot of people can just go in the country, they ask our government asked to put the visa and to put more restriction so we not have a migration crisis because of the AFCON. So it was not the Moroccan government refusing to give visa, it was more our government asking to put more restriction.
Okay.
But one way to look at it is that it worked out for both because there were several other cases where the Moroccans did not issue the visas. So in that case, there was a partnership with the Ivorians. But one must also be careful about the justifications that governments give for certain actions. And I'm not going to get into the whole United States situation now. This is
Yeah,
not the place to do it, especially because it's being recorded. So.
yeah, good.
But it's
Okay,
good to keep an eye on the specifics. Thank you, Yasmin.
thanks. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, earlier, Massimiliano also was making a comment about a Neapolitan footballer named Koulibaly from Senegal, who suffered a double kind of racism in Italy, both as African and as Neapolitan, kind of making an observation there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, this gets into a whole other issue, which I like to point out to my American, or I should say US students, about not running into the trap of thinking that these local identities are simply in Africa are simply an example of the type of negative stereotypes that we are all too familiar with that circulate in media discourses and elsewhere about Africa and Africans. I mean, the parochialism in Italy is, I think, much more fierce than many other places I've encountered on the African continent. So I like to think that that prepared me for some of the the peculiarities and the complexities of doing research as an outsider, particularly in Southern Africa. But yeah, and it's also a good reminder that people live multiple identities, often simultaneously, and that identity is at least a triangular kind of process. You are who you are what other people say you are, and then you are what you are based on what people think you are. And Koulibaly, was embraced by Neapolitan fans the same way that, sometimes foreign footballers from Africa who play in countries in Africa outside of their own are also embraced. And that's one of the beautiful things about the game is that it does provide a common ground, and there's as much unity that is generated as division. And so it's important. I tell my students to know about the forms of discrimination, and in Italy it's called territorial discrimination, which is kind of a silly legalistic term, but that Northerners discriminate against Southerners. It's partly a class thing as well. And so Koulibaly, yes, had a tough time, but he handled it beautifully. He was a real gentleman, and he really showed those idiots who would do monkey chants at him and call him, an earthquake victim from the famous earthquake in Naples in 1980. He really was a terrific spokesperson for humanity and for dignity and for respect. And football does provide the stage to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I, I just feel enlightened a lot today about on the world of football. Because most often when I get to the screen to watch football, it's about the essence of the game. And sometimes the beauty of the game blurs the things that are happening in the
Yeah,
backstage.
yes.
Yeah, so Peter, thank you so much for enlightening us today. And I'm so also very, very curious about your agency in football and Kaiser Chiefs. But I never supported Kaiser Chiefs. So I supported Mamelodi Sundowns um, in football.
Brazilians.
Yeah, so the two things I like I like to share my views on. I mean, building up from what you are saying, which is so interesting to me. The really commodification of football today. Mm, um, so it seems as if the major powers observe what it's pulling youth interest, and they try to design some form of control protocol to manage it. And this to me is what is happening now in a game that normally should function without boundaries and without this kind of regulatory forces. I mean, the extra regulatory forces that come in to kill the game. Because I remember when I heard that there are football club owners who are very corrupt. I was wondering where corruption comes from. Because football in our local context, for example, the kind of football that Professor Makoni played, not the one you played, on the streets and in the yards, it did not have this kind of corrupt corrupt mentality. And I'm sure that if you go down to the local communities and ask children playing football whether there's corruption in football, they'll tell you no. That's a game that generates pleasure. They derive satisfaction from mingling and competing. Now, where is this corruption from? Now, and it seems to me as though the regulatory forces, the macro regulatory forces that have been designed to manage football are in themselves conceived on some corrupt ideologies. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to share my understanding about is racism. And it comes back to what we have been doing in this forum. So racism, from my understanding, is in football is something that has happened for a very long time. And remember the last match between Real Madrid and Benfica. Um, um, Vinicius Junior walked out of the football pitch for some time because of racist chants. Who are the people doing racism? And one of the things that I get worried about is that how can somebody be watching a game, a very beautiful game, instead of enjoying the beauty of the game, he shifts his attention from the beauty of the game to racist um, chants, which end up kill the ecstasy which the game generates. So it seems the fight against racism has a long way to go, from my understanding. Has a very, very long way to go. And I would be like, if we have a way of generating more discussions on how to deal with this, because it seems, like I said, something that we are unable to kill, we are unable to wipe out. We're in it, the only thing we can do is maybe confront or accept it. Now, I think if we could find a way, or if there are many more discussions on strategies and approaches which can be developed to eradicate it, it'll make us more human than we think we are now. And it's the worst thing is the most unfortunate thing that it's penetrating football, a game that builds boundaries, a game that builds bridges, a game that connects people more. When a goal is scored by a white or a black, the reaction of the winning team or the team that scores knows no boundaries. When you look at the emotions at that time, if the goal is scored by a black or a white, the emotions are not discriminatory. Everybody jubilates, which is something which we ought to build on in building these bridges. Now, to talk about a macro level corruption, like you cited the case of Morocco and the FIFA, it's unfortunate that the gods that control us have penetrated football to the extent that we all remain flies to them. They kill us for their sport, as Shakespeare says. So this is what I think. Thank you so much.
I mean, if I could just say two things. One is football exists in society. So there is racism in society. It's football is going to unfortunately experience this. It's how they respond to it that is the most important thing. And unfortunately, the institutions have done a very poor job. The press has done an uneven job, if I could be generous. And that's where I think citizens, fans, but also scholars can play a role. When Jose Mourinho gets on camera and he blames Vinny Jr. for basically the racism he experienced, I mean, and does not get confronted by the interviewer. I mean, if I had hair, I would have ripped it out of my, I mean, when I heard this, I said, this is literally what the problem is. And in a way, we have to be careful because football, yes, builds bridges, but football, like all team sports, has an inherent contradiction. It unites while it divides. It's got that us versus them dynamic that is constantly at play. It's what makes it also so fantastic in a sense, if it's civil, right? Okay, so that's the one thing. And the second thing about corruption, I mean, corruption in football is, and not just Africa, right? The FIFA scandal was based in the United States, the one that more than 40 people were arrested for, right? That the FBI was involved back when it was a real law enforcement organization, and South Americans. And it was mostly, white, crooked men. So I'm not trying to stick out African officials as somehow, exceptional. This is a global issue, but it's about money and power. Very simple, not terribly complicated, and complete and total absence of any accountability, any transparency, any form of accepted means of proper governance. FIFA should be figuratively burnt to the ground. There is no way that FIFA can be reformed. If anything, this more recent this president here is even worse than the worst, most corrupt individual in the history of FIFA, Sepp Blatter. I never would have thought that. I honestly never would have thought that Gianni Infantino would be eons worse than Sepp Blatter. But here we are, 10 years later, and most of us are thinking, this is a hopeless project. Why does FIFA have the right, or has given itself, I should be more precise, given itself the right to be the arbiter of our game? Where has it been written? Did Moses on the tablets say FIFA owns football? No. this is something that unfortunately we are stuck with right now, but I think it's going to change. There are legal cases now unfolding that are challenging FIFA's monopoly of football. And that could be a start towards at least moderating the corrupt actions of this leadership.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, I think Boosie actually summarized what you were saying quite nicely. She says there is racism, ethnicism, sexism, etc. in society, and football is a part of society too. The elements that unite us can also divide us during a match. She also says that she is a Kaiser Chief supporter.
Mhm.
Desmond, your hand was up next.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Peter. I was getting a bit hopeful listening to you, Peter, and wanted to ask a question. But your last clarification, and especially Boosie's comments, made me a little bit less hopeful, and I wasn't even sure if I wanted to ask the question anymore. But since you called me, Ian, let me do that. So, a few years ago, I was invited by Chicago Tribune to comment on the Nigerian flag. They were running this project that where they were thinking about how people related to their national flags. And as you know, someone who is from that part of the world and lives in Chicago, they wanted to get my perspective. And during my interview with the reporter, I said that Nigerians are polarized around the project of the nation state, around the project of Nigeria, as I think is the case with much of the African continent. So that whenever you raise a Nigerian flag, it's sort of difficult to get people to come together around it. And I said there is only one exception, and that is when Nigeria is playing a game and Nigeria is winning. Everybody sort of wraps themselves around that green, white, green flag. Everybody becomes a Nigerian in that moment, right? And in listening to you reflect on the political, element here, I was wondering if there were possibilities for people to mobilize around that part of the possibility there, that is for football to bring people together, to unite people. Let me be even more specific with the Nigerian context. Anyone who's followed Nigerian politics recently knows that there is this very popular politician who seems to be the only politician in Nigeria who's not interested in taking people's money. The only state governor who ran the state for 2 terms, and instead of leaving the state coffers empty, actually left billions for the next administration. And he ran for president during the last tenure. Every evidence suggests that he won, but of course, he's not the president right now. And part of his political message was it doesn't matter which party you belong to, it doesn't matter which ethnicity or which religion. When you go to the store to buy a loaf of bread, you pay the same thing everybody else pays. The inflation gets you, the political instability gets you, it affects everybody. It doesn't matter which part of the country you are from. So the division is meaningless. As a matter of fact, it's helping to make sure you don't solve the problems that you can solve. So he was sort of carrying this message of unity, but that never really got everybody to sort of coalesce around that campaign. You still had some people who were working against him, even though eventually he technically won the election, although he was never recognized for it. So I see some convergence between what I think he was trying to do as a uniting force, the economic argument, and the social possibility for football to pull people together. So I was going to ask you, if you were to be advising this politician or the Nigerian, masses, and by extension, I could say the African, and you wanted to use football as sort of a tool for bringing people together to coalesce around political, economic agendas and so forth. What might you recommend? Like, how might you recommend that people go about being more intentional in using football as a tool for political and economic mobilization that unites people rather than divide them around a shared interest?
Wow, that's a fabulous question. I don't have a good answer for you. I also worry that we're placing a lot of pressure, putting a big burden on the shoulders of football to do something that governments and others have been trying to grapple with for a long, long time. So, having said that, I think where it can work is by looking at football as kind of a technology in many ways, where it's the people that matter. Football in itself is only significant because of people like us who care about it. If we didn't care about it, football would be like, playing marbles or horseshoes or whatever. I mean, it would not be the global game, the most important form of culture around the world. Okay, it's what really ties the world together. So, one way to do it is, for example, to de emphasize, reduce the focus on the elite game. And I know this might seem counterintuitive, perhaps, with the World Cup around the corner here in the United States and Mexico and Canada, which we're all probably quite excited about. But, this obsessive focus that we have with just a handful of clubs and players and leagues, I find is troubling, because what happens to the game at the school level? What happens to the game in the rural areas? What happens with infrastructure? What happens to coaching education? And on and on and on. This is where football lives. Football lives in the feet and in the hearts and in the heads of 99.9% of the people outside of Old Trafford, outside of, Soldier Field, or since you're in Chicago, outside of these marvelous arenas that we look at on TV and, probably save 3 or 4 years of salary to get into for one match now. Or parking is going to be $250 for one car at the World Cup in 2026. I mean, this is scandalous. This is scandalous. But you go and look at the situation at the grassroots in Latin America, on the African continent, but right here outside my neighborhood in Rome. And young kids can't afford to play. They don't have any space to play. They have to, if they, to get into a club, you need to pay. You need to pay for your uniforms, pay for all your equipment. The coaches are often just looking to make a buck, right? And this is draining the life out of football. And to me, this is where that combination of social health and citizenship meets football. If we try to promote participatory football, right, where boys and girls, anyone can play, and realize that only 1 in 10,000 members of professional club academies will ever make a living from football, and we reorient our priorities accordingly, I think then we can really start to mobilize people. Because what are you mobilizing for? You're mobilizing for social justice. You're mobilizing for equality of opportunity. You're mobilizing for solidarity and all those values that I think most sensible people care deeply about. And so when football is only about these narrow elites, and what clothes they're wearing, what cars they're driving, or what have you, who they're sleeping with. I mean, this is another level of corruption. It's a kind of a corruption, a colonization of the mind, to quote Ngugi. So we need to do what we can to reorient our priorities in many respects. And I think scholars have a role in that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Arthur, you seem ready to speak. Your hand is up as well.
Yeah, I have thanks for that talk. I found it absolutely fascinating. Fascinating. I have a general question, and I don't really feel that I know enough about soccer to ask it well, but I'm going to try my best. Does Africa, and even more specifically Black Africa, get its fair share of rewards from the soccer machine in terms of not only money, but also, I guess there's a board of directors at FIFA. How many of those people are African? So that's my question. Like I say, I don't know enough to ask a more precise question, but I think you get the idea.
Thank you, Arthur, for that question. I mean, I've argued in my work that Africa does not get its fair share. That in essence, and this is to simplify it somewhat, right? We're dealing with a core periphery type of dynamic. Accounting for the fact that in the 21st century, you've got intermediaries that are local, that have inserted themselves in this kind of global commodity chain. And so it's not like all of the beneficiaries are in the global north and all of the victims of the process are in the global south and specifically on the African continent. But the dynamic is very much like that. So, for example, take migration of talent as a perfect example. This is a very clear extraction of human resources for the benefit of clubs and leagues, and now increasingly national teams in the North. Similarly, there's a dynamic that has also played out in interesting ways out of this migration process that benefits the North disproportionately, and that is that the children of migrants who have obtained citizenship and now live in the global North, their children qualify to play for African nations. And so there was a case recently at AFCON where Zidane's son, Luca, was the goalkeeper for Algeria. You see? And we had the Boateng case, which was even more fascinating, possibly in Ghana a few years ago, whereby Jerome Boateng was playing defense for Germany in the same match that his brother Kevin Prince was playing on the forward line for Ghana. And Kevin Prince Boateng had showed no interest in playing for Ghana until he figured out that he couldn't play for Germany, and then he said, "Oh well, then I'll go and play for Ghana." And there were a lot of Ghanaians who were not thrilled about that. But again, that's at the expense, really, of say a player who chose to remain local, not to migrate, and then sees their place being taken by somebody who doesn't even speak any local language, has never really lived there, has a blood tie, and that's about it. So migration is a clear example of this. Now, there are cases where Sadio Mane, the great player from Senegal, who's now finishing his career in Saudi Arabia, played at Liverpool and elsewhere, has done great things with the money that he's made as a professional. He's gone back to his village in Casamance and built a hospital, a school. He's the son of a long a line of very respected holy people, of imams. And I'm not saying that that's not a positive thing. Of course, he has a good heart and he chooses to use the money that he worked hard for in that way and for the social good. Excellent. But, that's a bit like trying to sweep the ocean back with a broom. So at the macro level, right, what is football in Senegal domestically? You ask any good hardcore Senegalese fan, and they don't pay much attention to what Jeanne d'Arc is doing in the local league. They're all busy going to watch Arsenal on the TV, right? And so there's also a cultural, theft that is going on in a sense, as well as the fact that the local football market is pretty limited. So, this is very much like the colonial experience where the Europeans did not develop internal markets, very intentionally so. Why create competitors for the European firms, right? Why are the railway lines set up the way they are? Because they're geared towards extraction of resources, not to make local markets and economies foster. So those are just some examples. I mean, I think that the fandom, the African fandom of European football is one of the most contested areas right now in the world that I inhabit often, which is that of kind of the cultural study of football, because there's a bit of a disagreement over whether African fans who have become assiduous followers of European teams are kind of falling into the colonization of the mind kind of process, or whether they're actually exercising their global citizenship by participating in that type of fandom. And that's a really interesting conversation. But personally, I think if all of your emotional investments and a lot of your disposable income, whether it's to pay for internet or satellite or merchandising, is going towards the North, I mean, I can't see that being a net positive on the African side. Now, in terms of officials, I mean, it used to be that African officials were fighting for the democratization of the world game until the 80s. Now they're kind of part of the problem. Once you become part of that network, does it matter that a certain number of the FIFA Council representatives are African? And now it's not just men, there's a number of women on the council too. I'm not so sure, honestly. I mean, I think because of the reasons I was ranting about earlier, that once you become part of that mechanism, it's almost inevitable that you're going to be susceptible to the kind of influences that lead you down the wrong path. I hope I'm proven wrong in the future. I don't want to sound cynical, but there is a history there. So we need an alternative. We need an alternative. And there, I think there are many officials and coaches and players and former players who are willing to step up and do the right thing. But in the present structures, I think it's stacked against the people who want to do good and can do good.
Mhm. Yeah.
Very
Sad.
partial answer.
Sad.
I'm afraid so. But they don't get their way all the time. Between, and again, football can kill you. There have been dictators who have invested in football and then realized they made a huge mistake because they couldn't control the outcome, and suddenly they had very angry constituents at their door.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that enlightening response.
Thank you, Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to switch over to the chat for just 1 second. Libohang Matibela writes that he often wondered why political parties, especially popular ones, would campaign at a football match in a stadium. I mention popular ones because the chairpersons of both Chiefs and Pirates come from Soweto, and Sundown's chairman is a sibling with the president's wife. Just last week, Saturday Pirates beat Chiefs 3-0. 3-0, sorry. The stadiums get packed to capacity anytime whenever these three teams play. I never looked at football as something that could be so political. Thank you, Peter, for this enlightening presentation. I am brand new to this forum, invited by Professor Subusiso.
And just a footnote to that, Kaiser Chiefs was formed from a split from Orlando Pirates. Yeah, so I once asked Ahmed Katrada, who spent 26 years in prison with Nelson Mandela, including nearly 2 decades on Robben Island, if he supported Orlando Pirates or Kaiser Chiefs, and he gave me a very stern look. And he said, "Of course, I support Orlando Pirates." And I thought it was because Nelson Mandela's home is in Orlando West. And he said, no. Orlando Pirates is like the ANC and Kaiser Chiefs is like the PAC because the PAC split from the ANC, just like Chiefs split from Pirates. So he said, of course, I'm for Pirates.
Yeah, thank you. Mbache, you have your hand up.
Okay. Thank you so much for the talk, Mr. Peter, Dr. Peter. Actually, I have a couple of worries as far as football is concerned, because I've been writing about football tactics for quite some time now, I think about 5 years. And the first thing I would like to know is that, in fact, this one's like a comment. I believe that, do you think that the inability of African teams to actually win the World Cup is down to talent, or down to inability, or it is down to other factors of injustice, such as more African teams not taking part in the World Cup, because a massive continent like Africa should actually have more teams participating in the World Cup. It is true that they have increased the number of teams this time around, but then I believe that we are supposed to have more, something that Jose Mourinho talked about some time ago. And this equally makes me think of the Italian 90s. Growing up as a kid, I heard a lot of Cameroonians talking about the Italian 90s and what happened to Cameroon, that it got eliminated by England. They talk about the injustice that happened in that particular game. And so I want to find out from you if you believe it is down to inability or it is down to other factors of injustice that that African countries don't make it. The second point is that when I look at the Premier League, I feel like there is a lot of hidden racism within the Premier League. One of the instances that I'll cite here is the fact that the first black referee that officiated a game in the Premier League was actually last year, Sam Allison. And we haven't seen another black referee officiate a game, I mean, as the main referee. The question is it that African, black referees lack the quality to officiate games, or it is down to the injustice, the racism that we are talking about here? I equally go down as well to Napoli. When you look at Napoli's director, his comments about African players coming over for the African Cup of Nations, he said African players shouldn't be signed because in January they will be leaving, or December, because they left earlier, but he said in January they will be leaving for the African Cup of Nations, and he even threatened to withhold some of these players, and nothing has been done so far to reproach his comments. I equally think about Lookman, what happened to Lookman in Atalanta, where he actually missed the penalty, and the coach went out and called out Lookman, and nothing was done. When I look at other European players, I haven't seen coaches doing such to other players, but then they did it to Lookman. And finally, I look at African coaches as well. I think we have good African coaches, but we have not seen top European sides actually picking up the African coaches that we have. We have coaches that actually have styles, system, tactics that reflect the trend of today. A very good example, you have the likes of Pitso Mosimane, who was very, very successful in South Africa. You have Ronlani Mokoena, whose style too is extremely good. We are talking about the tiki-taka style, the close build-up style, and the rest. These are coaches that have shown that they have a very high level. But still, we do not find top European clubs, picking up these European coaches, despite the coaches submitting, the applications and the rest. Maybe just to add this one, just to add this final point. Do you equally think that extraversion, the act of copying European tactical philosophies, is something that is pulling us behind? Because what really gave us pride here in Africa is that we had the natural footballers. Talking about footballers who grew up on the streets, the likes of Roger Milla, you look at Samuel Eto'o, Michael Essien, strong backgrounds, how they struggled on the streets, and then they got to the top. They were able to have this strong mentality to resist the racism. But when you look at the footballers today, who actually look like they are more of robotic footballers because they are being trained to do everything. They are not allowed to think like Pep Guardiola. He tells you this position, you are supposed to be there. Eto'o even made a comment that when Pep Guardiola got into Barcelona, he actually made a move and he scored a goal. But Pep Guardiola was not happy. Pep Guardiola told him that you were not supposed to be in that position. You were supposed to be in a different position. Even though you have scored, you're supposed to respect it. And so when you look at most African teams trying to copy this style where they teach, the football, everything, your positioning and everything, do you think we are losing as far as that front is concerned? Because it seems we do not have the necessary resources to keep up with the Western teams. So do you think we need to find our own indigenous ways of actually, getting into competitions and trying as much as possible to get glory at the end of the day? Thank you.
Wow, Mbacha, there was a lot in that. and I'm kind of a forgetful historian, which is probably not a good thing. So I may have to ask you to repeat a couple of those questions that you posed, but I want to start with your last one. As an Italian, one of the things that distinguishes our take on football is a deep and abiding love for tactics. And so your question strikes at the heart. I lecture about this in my class. I have we're one of the only countries where we have really like a university of coaching in a beautiful, idyllic setting on the outskirts of Florence called Coverciano. And I try to transform my East Lansing classroom 2 or 3 times a semester in my global soccer class into a little Coverciano. So tactics mean a lot to me, and I've thought about this issue of style and tactics and modes of play quite a lot. And I've written about the way in which this has transpired in the history of African football. And I just want to say one thing, which is that in every country around the world, the conditions in which you grow up playing is going to affect the kind of style you bring at the higher level. Okay. But on the African continent, you're dealing with now, 1.5 billion people speaking over 2,000 languages in 54 countries. There are a lot of different expressions. So there's not just one. And, street ball is becoming less and less important globally. Mostly because there's less and less space that kids can use in urban areas, and also because they start playing formal football quite early, and they get channeled into these, as you said, robotic ways of playing very early, even on the African continent. But having said that, I'm a true believer in that, you have to dig into your own cultural and historical roots to produce a style of play with different types of tactics, depending on the situation, that speaks to your maybe your essence to some extent. And you can think around the world about, say, the Brazilian style, which I don't think has existed for many, many, many years. But you think of Jogo Bonito, right? And this association with dribbling and with samba, which again, we don't see very much at all anymore from Brazil, but that's the ideal. In Italy, we used to pride ourselves on defense, not defense in parking the bus. People misunderstand, but defense in stifling the opposition's play in order to get the ball and quickly drive a dagger through the heart of the opposing team, the famous counterattack or contropiede, right? The Dutch have been manipulating space for hundreds of years in order to survive, given that a third of their country is below sea level, right? It's not a surprise, as David Winner showed in his work, right, that they developed total football, which is about manipulating the space on the pitch in a very coherent and thoughtful and rehearsed way, which is how we get to Johan Cruyff and Pep Guardiola and all of that. So yes, African nations have to find a way, but I have to say, having said this, that today the styles and tactics of football are becoming very, very similar. Very similar. Everybody has WhatsApp. Everybody can watch what everybody else is doing. There's no mysteries anymore. You go to the World Cup, you know exactly how the other team is going to play. You know exactly the tendencies of each individual player. There's group chats that the defenders have on African teams and every other team. The guys will receive the 10-second video that shows how the guy they're marking, who's going to be playing in their area of the pitch, 9 times out of 10 is going to go this way with the ball. On the corner kicks, they do this movement. They know everything. They know everything. Where's the surprise? And so you get these boring games. Everybody is just passing the ball sideways and backwards, sideways and backwards. And Africa is part of this global transformation. So I'm not sure how much tactical innovation one can introduce at this point that's going to change these trends. Rule changes, I think, are going to be more important, and we can talk about those. Coaching is very important. You've made a very good point that there are no African coaches in the top leagues in Europe. And this is one form of discrimination that's very clear. There are also no black coaches in most of these positions. There's a few here and there. But as soon as the team starts to have a small run of negative results, those coaches are taken out and they're often not given a second chance, let alone a third, fourth, or fifth chance like a lot of the local white coaches get. And also discrimination you can see in the management and in refereeing, all of those. It's true. The data don't lie. You get great diversity on the pitch, especially in the English Premier League, right? But you don't see that diversity at all in management. After their careers are over, very few become talent scouts or make it into the higher ranks of the Football Association and so on. And that is clearly a glass ceiling, if you want to use that old expression. Now, for African coaches, one of the challenges is that CAF doesn't, as far as I know, this may have changed very recently, but they don't run the coaching courses you need to get, say, the equivalent of the UEFA Pro license. In order to do this, I know two friends of mine had to go to Scotland to do their licensing. I mean, this is difficult for the vast majority of people. You know, where are you going to get the money now? You know, visa issues and goodness knows what else. But why isn't CAF taking care of that very important piece of the puzzle? Because coaching education is absolutely vital. You cannot have a street footballer show up at a professional football academy and expect the youngster to be able to know all the things that these other boys and girls have been training for years on. It's almost impossible for that young footballer to succeed in that context. So that's another big piece of the puzzle. The final thing I want to say, and I'm probably forgetting several of your very interesting points, but inability versus injustice. I don't think that the fact that an African national team hasn't won the men's World Cup or the women's World Cup is due to either inability or injustice. I mean, honestly, I mean, the United States hasn't won a World Cup on the men's side. The United States, you know, was a semifinalist in 1930. People forget. I mean, the United States, 350 million people, you know, most powerful and richest country in the world. They haven't won a World Cup. So, I mean, it's only a 1 month tournament. It's not necessarily indicative of much else. So, you know, an African nation will win in hopefully in my lifetime and in your lifetime. But even after that happens, you know, what is African football going to look like? To me, is a big question. It's a big question. If all the players who are on that World Cup team were born in Europe and play for European teams, you know, how is it different from France winning the World Cup with 80% of their teams of African descent?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I wanted to return to the chat for just a second because there's a lot of activity going on. Patience brought up that the previous discussion about racism in football, it strikes me as to the number of Global South footballers who are continuously accused of rape and ripped off of their hard-earned money. And then Michael Scott also has a couple of questions. He first of all says, thank you, Dr. Alegi, for this fascinating dive into and the passion on this topic. He has a few questions. Could you assess the writings and portrayals of Ryszard Kapuscinski and Eduardo Galeano on the soccer wars? And are you aware of any in-depth assessment of the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Doha as a decolonial and or as a pan-Arab African departure from its previous European contexts? And finally, are there any good studies of the impact on African youth of Sadio Mane's remarkable personal intervention in the chaotic and controversial conclusion to the latest AFCON final?
So much there. Yeah, I mean, Patience raises a really important question that also is not discussed enough, which is the case of sexual assault in sport. I wouldn't just say football, sport as a whole. And, you know, we've seen this affecting women and men, and, you know, it's happened in Europe, it's happened in North America, it's happened on the African continent, in Latin America. We haven't heard about cases in Asia, but I would be very surprised if Asia were an exception. This is really, really troubling on so many levels, because sport, unfortunately, has these rigid hierarchies that are baked into it. And, you know, we like, as people who practice sports or watch sports, we like to emphasize the positive, and it's important not to forget that we do it for positive outcomes, of course, but we also can't be blind to what is happening, where young people are being exploited on an unimaginable scale, and where a culture of silence has prevailed for decades, because just like it happened with the church, nobody wants to take responsibility. Everybody's scared that if they raise their voice, they're going to be punished or ostracized or labeled in some way. And in sport, you've got the added pressure that, unlike a priest who has a long lifespan potentially in that profession, if you want to call it that, A footballer only has a certain number of years available. And if you make a coach angry, they can end your career quite quickly. And so this is a really serious problem. And I think it's just come to the surface, and we need to treat each case seriously. We need to be very careful. There's a legal process that needs to be undergone, but certainly there needs to be a safety net and very careful oversight be placed, particularly on youth football. And this affects everyone. So that is a really important issue. There were a couple of points that were raised by the previous person. If you could just remind me what they were.
Actually, before I do that, Mbache left a comment asking about if there's any way that he could contact you in the future. Is it okay if I perhaps put your email address in the chat?
Of course, my email is public. I'm at Michigan State, so it's just my last name at msu.edu. Yep. Please. I should have mentioned that earlier. So please remind me, there were a couple of really interesting questions that were posed.
Yeah, this was from Michael Scott. Two
Michael,
things.
yes.
He's curious about what you think about the soccer wars from Ryszard
Kapuscinski
Kapuscinski
and
and
Galeano,
Eduardo.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
The second one was talking about the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Doha and whether or not
Yes.
this represents a kind of I suppose decolonial move or some kind of a departure from the sort of Eurocentrism of the World Cup. And then finally, curious about Sadio Mane's intervention in the chaotic and controversial conclusion to the AFCON final.
Okay. No, I don't know about anyone who's written on that specific incident. There are two good commentaries on AFCON. The one that I would recommend folks grapple with is Simona Kindes's piece in Africa as a Country called Remember AFCON. Let's see if I can put that link in the chat. I'll just post it here and see. Yeah, that should work. That's a really thoughtful piece. Simon played, by the way. He's a professor, retired professor from Benin, who taught at the University of Wisconsin Parkside campus until just recently. And he played for Benin in the late 1970s. And he's a wonderful scholar of West African music and also sport. And so, again, getting behind the scenes of what went down at AFCON might be interesting for folks to read that. And then, since I'm talking about the great Akindes family, my good friend and co-author Gerard Akindes posted a nice piece. It's in French, but you can rely on AI translation to get a sense, if you don't speak French, about the move of the African Nations Cup to 4-year tournament instead of 2-year tournament. So check that out as well. Kapuscinski and Galeano, I mean, Kapuscinski didn't really care about football, but he wrote a fascinating book about the Honduras-El Salvador conflict and was one of the first journalists to kind of point to the fact that, we should pay attention to sport as a potential catalyst for these larger dynamics, and in this case, a very painful conflict. But soccer doesn't really play a big role in that book. I mean, it's what triggers the ultimate confrontation, but it was already in the making. But Kapuscinski was a fascinating figure. But I think now, several decades removed, I think particularly his reporting on Africa, on the one hand, it's remarkable to have a Polish maybe diplomat is not the right word, although he was employed by the Foreign Service of Poland in some capacity, but that he mingled with ordinary people in a way that you don't see many foreign correspondents do these days. They prefer to hang out in the five-star hotels and rely on taxi drivers as their main source of information. So Kapuscinski was laudable in that way, but I think he was also problematic and sort of with his racial essentializing and reliance on, I don't know, facile stereotypes at times. Galeano is marvelous writer. I used to call him, the footballing bard par excellence. And his book, Soccer and Sun and Shadow, is one of my favorites, but it has no women in it. it's a very sort of, traditionally macho piece in a sense. Like, how can you write about an entire world and particularly, the Western Hemisphere and the Spanish-speaking Western Hemisphere specifically, and never even mention a woman? Today, I don't think he would get away with it, perhaps, but in the early 90s, that book was really quite fascinating with these little vignettes, so artfully written. It reminded me in a way of he did for soccer what he did for Latin American studies with Open Veins of Latin America, that amazing book that he was later in his life asked about, and he said, "I'm quite embarrassed about that book." He said it hasn't really stood the test of time, and I said a lot of stupid things in it. But I feel like that about a lot of stuff I wrote when I was young too. So I kind of sympathize with your blind spots when you're still young and not very knowledgeable. But Galeano, I think, really brought the poetic into writing about football. Something that social scientists probably we should pay a little more attention to because our writing can be awfully dry and uninspiring. And Galeano just always had that lyrical ability, comparing the end of a soccer match and the feeling of sitting in the stadium by yourself to the end of Carnival. And sort of the feeling you have after this great party and you've given everything you had and you smoked all the substances you could have smoked and you drank all the liquids you could have drank, and you have absolutely nothing left. And there's just a little bit of smoke from the flares left, perhaps. And it's just that feeling of melancholy, and he just captured it so beautifully. And I think we as scholars could do a lot better when we write about sport and football in particular to bring that emotional quality out. Now, Qatar 2022, yes, there have been analyses that this was a moment of decolonial assertion of power. I think there is something to that. I don't want to fall into the trap of, those who, whenever there is sport being done outside of the Western core of the world, it's sports washing. But if the US does it, it's sports diplomacy. Right? I don't want to fall into that trap, but I also don't feel comfortable at all going into the direction of, putting Qatar on a pedestal and saying, what a great moment of decolonizing world sport. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go there. When you're silencing the simple expression of equality through LGBTQ rights, for instance, among other things. To me, that really throws a wrench into any kind of attempt of painting Qatar specifically as this great progressive force in the Gulf. I'm sorry, I'm not going there. There has been some good writing on the topic. Most recently, there was a special issue edited by Sean Jacobs at the New School. Again, I'm away from my office. I don't have the reference here. It's an open access journal. If you Google Sean Jacobs New School football journal, something along those lines, all the articles are open access. And there's one very, very thought-provoking piece on precisely this topic, on Qatar and evaluating Western perspectives of hosting the World Cup in light of some of these dynamics that we've been talking about. So yeah, it's starting to come out. Yeah, so it's quite interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Lots to think about there.
Those are great answers, very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Emmanuel, your hand is still up. I really appreciate your patience. Maybe he stepped away for a second. In the meantime, there's a lot of interesting comments I'd just like to share from the chat that aren't necessarily questions, but thought-provoking. Eric says, I made up my mind to play football in the streets and in the yards, and I feel the warmth of humanity and not worry about macro level football that's infested. I'll not bother about supporting Mamelodi Sundowns and the Kaiser Chiefs again. And then Vicky says, according to Shakespeare, it was an insult to be a football player. And I quite like Dorothy's comment as well. This discussion evokes a lot of emotion in me, as I was a professional football player at one point in my life. The corruption, sexism, abuse of power, social disdain at the time for women's football, and the lack of structures, including adequate healthcare for players, ultimately stifled my interest in the sport. This remains an understudied subject, especially within the women's football divisions in Africa. Maybe I should dedicate the rest of my career to this subject.
Yes, 100%.
Let's see, Emmanuel, are you still with us?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, please.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm Emmanuel from Ghana. Just listening to Prof, and I'm very happy about the discussion that is going on. But I want to comment on football and corruption. I was very happy when you mentioned Asante Kotoko, because that's the team that I also support as a Ghanaian. And yes, football and corruption. I think in about 6 years ago, there was an investigation by an undercover called Anas, Arameyawa Anas, on an investigation he dubbed the number 12. His target was about referees and their role in corruption and determining football results. And the number 12 man was the referee, who is supposed to be a middle person and ensure fairness. But sometimes football administrators normally use them against clubs to determine results. And some of these referees were even banned by CAF and the rest. So football and corruption, I don't know whether to call them brothers or they connect to each other very well. And that is why I heard Prof saying that even with the AFCON final, it was difficult to decide which referee to be appointed. Because sometimes these football administrators too have interest in who wins. Right from the onset, clubs or countries who were playing against Morocco were complaining about officiating. And some of them felt that it seems there is a scheme to make sure Morocco wins the AFCON, although they have fantastic players, they have very nice team, a well-built team, which sometimes I believe that those who are supposed to be in charge, the watchmen, nobody watches over them. So sometimes their interests are also pursued or pushed into a scheme of affairs. That is what I believed influenced the Senegalese action, that thinking that after being denied a goal and in space of seconds, being awarded the penalty to our opponent, then what we are hearing is true. So it informed their decision that then they will have to walk out, which even dented the reputation of the game. So that is my initial comment, that corruption in football is something that is known worldwide. Even when you look at the UEFA Champions League and you look at the draw, clearly you could see that it seems that people want at least Barcelona to win something this year, because looking at the path on which the team that they've met and the team that they are going to meet, I think the greatest opposition that they can meet will be Arsenal, which will be somewhere the semi-final. And it happens not to only Barcelona, to other clubs like Real Madrid. Sometimes they will be facing some small clubs, and you see them progressing. And I believe that we have to be careful, because yes, football unites, but sometimes it can also create tension and confusion. Prof, I want to ask this question. Looking at the way you've delved into football and its other connections, do you think people purchase football clubs to serve as decoy or to serve as a veil to cover their corrupt practices? Looking at, I think, was it Tashin Shinawatra who purchased Manchester City? And later the English press and government decided that no, because he has a lot of issues, they will not allow him. Do you think people purchase football clubs, especially politicians, millionaires, and the rest? They purchase these football clubs to serve as a decoy or veil to cover up their corrupt practices? That's my question. Thank you very much.
It's certainly possible. Certainly possible. When you have these phenomenal amounts of money, and money can move around rather quickly in our globalized, computerized economy these days. Could be a way perhaps to evade tax or what have you. Yeah, I think it's possible. I think, however, it's more likely perhaps that these really are vanity projects. I mean, a person who has billions, what are they going to do with their time? I mean, how many golden yachts can you buy? How many airplanes can you possess? How many? I don't know. I'm just wondering. It seems to me these clubs become shiny objects for them, and then once a couple of them buy them, then others have to join the party, and then they can probably get together on some Epstein Island and chat about it. I mean, I think there's probably other ways that they can hide their money or pursue their corrupt ways. Although, the Panama Papers were very insightful on this. They're still available, and a lot of scholars have been digging through the Epstein files quite religiously, and you can search for FIFA through the Epstein files. Things do come up, but the Panama Papers are still out there, and that's how we learned about how these contracts are structured. We learned about the difference between salary and image rights and how those sometimes elude the tax authorities in more or less legal ways. Both Cristiano Ronaldo, and Leo Messi were sentenced to what, 2 years for tax evasion in Spain, right? We wouldn't have known that probably if it hadn't been for the Panama Papers. So, yeah, I mean, referee bribes are almost as old as the game itself, and you're right to point out that they happen everywhere. And I wanted to raise the question of gambling too, because these days, especially in the United States, it's quite obvious to all of us who switch on any kind of sporting event. We are being force-fed gambling adverts 24/7. Indeed, the sportscasts themselves are becoming vectors of selling gambling advertisement. So ESPN Sports Center has a segment devoted to the odds of a particular game, right? I think this is hugely problematic. We've already seen the betting scandal in the NBA break out with several players and former players and coaches involved. And you know that this is happening in football as well. I mean, why would basketball be an outstanding, exceptional case? So to me, this is going to create a lot of problems, especially in the lower leagues, because it's harder to fix a game in the Premier League or at the World Cup than it is in the fourth division in Moldavia. Who's following those matches? So, and the way in which gambling is really just eating football, literally, morally, and in other ways, to me, that's deeply, deeply troublesome. And I'm not saying this from a position of somebody who has never put, $2 on the outcome of a game. I'm not taking a holier than thou position. We are now at the point where we have casinos in our pockets, right? And they're targeting our students. They're targeting our students between the age of 18 and 25. That is their key demographic. They want to get them addicted to this kind of daily waging, spot betting, as we used to call it, and it's succeeding. I can tell you more than half of the men in my classes are betting regularly. So to me, is this how we're creating the future generations of football fans? Because if it is, I think we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to be mindful of time. I'm sorry I could not get to everything in the chat. I think your conversation clearly fired up a lot of people and got a lot of people very excited. Makoni, do you have any final words?
No, except to say again, thank you very much to Peter for this fascinating conversation. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues who were raising questions and engaging with Peter. I think after this, we move to the after party now, isn't it?
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, now we move to the after party, which is unmoderated, and Peter can listen or and sneak away to go to